What happens if your brain never feels safe enough to relax? Not because danger is constantly present, but because your nervous system remains activated even when nothing is actually wrong. You sit down to rest, but your mind keeps moving. Your body stays tense. Your thoughts continue scanning, preparing, predicting, and anticipating. Even in silence, your brain feels unable to switch off. And over time, this changes the way your brain functions. Let's begin with the nervous system. The human nervous system is built around adaptation and survival, and it operates through two major autonomic states: sympathetic activation, commonly known as fight or flight, and parasympathetic activation, associated with recovery, digestion, immune regulation, and neurological restoration. Both systems are essential. The problem begins when one system becomes dominant for too long. Under chronic stress, uncertainty, emotional overload, or continuous stimulation, the brain gradually prioritizes survival over recovery. Sympathetic activation becomes prolonged, while parasympathetic recovery becomes suppressed. Now your body remains partially activated all the time, even during rest. This is not always dramatic. Sometimes it appears as subtle tension, difficulty relaxing, shallow breathing, emotional irritability, hyper-awareness, or the inability to mentally disengage. Now let's move into the brain itself. One of the key systems involved is the amygdala, a structure deeply involved in emotional salience and threat detection. Under chronic stress, the amygdala becomes increasingly reactive, meaning your brain becomes more sensitive to uncertainty, emotional cues, social evaluation, and possible danger. This process is adaptive in short-term survival situations. But when prolonged, it creates hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a state where the brain continuously scans for potential problems, even in objectively safe environments. Now, the prefrontal cortex becomes involved. The prefrontal cortex regulates emotional responses, attention, impulse control, and cognitive flexibility. Under chronic stress exposure, prefrontal regulation weakens, reducing your ability to deactivate unnecessary alarm signals. This creates imbalance. The emotional brain becomes louder. The regulatory brain becomes quieter. Now the nervous system remains on, even when no immediate threat exists. Let's go deeper into stress chemistry. When the brain perceives threat or uncertainty, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, often called the HPA axis, becomes activated. This triggers cortisol release, increasing glucose availability, alertness, and energy mobilization. Short-term cortisol elevation is useful, but chronic cortisol exposure changes the brain. Research has shown prolonged cortisol dysregulation affects hippocampal function, emotional regulation, memory consolidation, attentional stability, and sleep architecture. This is why chronic stress often produces cognitive fog, emotional exhaustion, memory difficulties, and persistent fatigue. Now consider recovery. Most people think rest simply means stopping activity. But neurologically, recovery is more complex. Real recovery requires a transition from sympathetic dominance into parasympathetic regulation. And this transition only occurs when the brain perceives safety. Without safety signaling, the nervous system remains partially activated. This means you can lie in bed while your nervous system remains in defense mode. You may be physically still while neurologically stressed. Now let's connect this to psychology. The brain learns through repetition and prediction. When stress, uncertainty, overstimulation, emotional conflict, or unpredictability become chronic, the brain begins adapting to those conditions as normal. This process is called allostatic adaptation. Over time, stress stops feeling unusual. It becomes baseline. Many people living under chronic activation no longer recognize they are stressed because their nervous system has normalized the state. Now, this creates another problem. The brain begins associating stillness with vulnerability. Silence feels uncomfortable. Rest feels unproductive. Relaxation creates anxiety. And many people unconsciously seek stimulation because stimulation feels safer than stillness. This is why people constantly check phones, overwork, multitask, or fill every quiet moment with input. The brain is attempting to maintain predictability and control. Now, let's connect this to attentional systems. Under chronic hypervigilance, the brain allocates excessive attentional resources toward monitoring, prediction, and environmental scanning. This reduces working memory efficiency and increases cognitive fatigue. Your brain becomes overloaded, not because you are weak, but because it never stops processing. Now, dopamine becomes involved. Under chronic stress conditions, dopamine signaling often becomes dysregulated. Motivation decreases, reward sensitivity weakens, and emotionally meaningful experiences feel blunted. This creates emotional numbness. Now people confuse exhaustion with laziness. But neurologically, the issue is often chronic survival activation rather than lack of discipline. Now consider sleep. Sleep is one of the primary mechanisms for neurological restoration, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, glymphatic clearance, and nervous system recalibration. But chronic sympathetic activation interferes with sleep depth and sleep quality. You may sleep for hours, while your brain never fully recovers. Now the cycle strengthens. Stress increases vigilance. Vigilance prevents recovery. Lack of recovery increases stress sensitivity. And eventually, the nervous system becomes trapped in persistent activation. Now let's discuss emotional consequences. When the brain remains chronically activated, emotional resilience decreases. Minor stressors feel larger. Uncertainty becomes more emotionally intense, and tolerance for cognitive or emotional demand declines. This often appears as irritability, emotional exhaustion, overthinking, anxiety, indecision, avoidance, or burnout. Now here is the key insight. The brain does not recover simply because danger disappears. The brain recovers when it experiences enough consistent signals of safety. Safety is biological. Safety is neurological. And without safety, recovery mechanisms remain incomplete. So, how do you reverse this? First, reduce continuous stimulation. Constant novelty and information maintain sympathetic activation and prevent neurological downregulation. Second, create predictable recovery cycles. The nervous system responds strongly to consistency and environmental predictability. Third, regulate physiological state directly. Slow breathing, reduced sensory input, physical movement, sunlight exposure, and lower environmental noise can reduce autonomic activation and increase parasympathetic signaling. Fourth, reduce cognitive overload. Your brain cannot recover while processing excessive unresolved input. Fifth, tolerate stillness. Because many overstimulated nervous systems initially interpret stillness as discomfort, but stillness is where recovery begins. And finally, understand this. Your brain was never designed for permanent survival mode. It was designed to alternate between activation and restoration. And when restoration disappears, eventually the brain itself begins to break down. If you found this helpful, subscribe to Nexplain